Hi, it's Anna. Welcome back to Books on the Go. I'm here with a June wrap up, and I just realised I never did a May wrap up in the midst of everything, so I've completely lost track of what I read and when, but I'm just going to talk about some recent books that I read in the last month or so. And so first up, Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie, and I did this one as a buddy read with my daughter, who was reading it because she loves the Robin Stevens books, the Murder Most Unladylike series, and the latest one is coming out. It might even be the final one, is coming out, I think, September or later this year, and is set on the Nile. And I think Robin Stevens pays homage to Agatha Christie. So my daughter wanted to read this one, and I had never read it, although I think I've seen a TV adaptation or a film adaptation, and I know there's a new one coming out, but I actually couldn't remember the plot, so I don't think I had read or seen it, which was good. So anyway, I loved this. It was a really, really good mystery. It's an ensemble cast, as always. So there's a group of people going on a boat down the Nile, travelling down the Nile, and you meet them first before they take this journey, and then you meet Hercule Poirot, and he's also on the trip. So it's actually a long time before the murder happens, and that I really liked because Poirot also is observing all the characters, and of course he has a suspicion that something's not right, so you know that something might happen, and you're sort of with him in these observations and trying to guess who might have a motive, who might the victim be, and also who might have a motive to commit murder. And of course they all have secrets that are revealed gradually, even if they're not the main crime. And so it really keeps you guessing all the way along. And then, of course, the murder happens, and then you try to piece together how it happened. And it's a very, very cleverly plotted murder mystery. And one of the things I liked about it, of course, is that it takes you back to that era of the 1920s, I want to say, but I could be wrong, where things are just a more genteel pace. And Agatha Christie herself has written a foreword to this one where she says it's one of her favourite of her novels, and she thinks it's a great way to escape and sort of travel to Egypt by way of armchair travel. And that particularly applies at the moment when we can't travel anywhere, and it does give you the feels of going down the Nile, the hot climate, the leisurely pace, and that's against the backdrop of the engrossing mystery. So I really recommend this if you enjoy Agatha Christie or cozy crime, or if you just want a break from other things that we're reading and watching and consuming at the moment. It was very good. So Death on the Nile. Then, quite a change of pace, we have What Belongs to You by Garth Greenwell, and this had been sitting on my shelf for 2 years. I was inspired to read it by Matthew Sharappa's video a couple of years ago, where he sold it to someone in the bookshop and made a very funny but also not funny video about this customer's reaction. But that sort of kick-started my consciousness about realising I wasn't reading enough queer fiction or LGBTQI plus fiction, and I really loved it. And it was a book that, even though it's short, there is so much to unpack and so much to think about in for such a short book. And so I think it would be excellent for book clubs, for example. But just a beautiful piece of writing. It's an American teacher in Sofia, Bulgaria, and he falls in love with a young man called Mieko, and it's the relationship starts off as a casual relationship, but then develops into a more obsessive sort of affair. And in the sort of middle of the book, he reflects back on his personal story and where his upbringing in America and his treatment by his father, and it's really poignant, and it gives you a lot to think about in terms of why he is how he is in the present day story. It's affected how he has, experiences his relationships as an adult and his sense of himself. And there's a lot in this book. The sentences are beautiful. There's another book by Garth Greenwell, Cleanness, which I also read in June and we'll talk about. And in a similar vein, where just the quality of the writing and the way the sentences propel you forward even when not much is happening is masterful. And this was his debut novel, so it's quite incredible and deserves all of the praise which it has received. So that's What Belongs to You, and I recommend that one if you haven't read it. I was a bit late coming to it, but I'm very glad I did. So next up, the same author, Garth Greenwell, and this is his latest book, Cleanness. And it's a collection of short stories, but they're all interwoven and they seem to have the same protagonist, which again is an American teacher at a school in Sofia, Bulgaria, at the language school. And I think Garth Greenwell has described it almost as a song cycle, which is a beautiful way of thinking about it. And he does have a musical background, which also informs his writing, I think, and the musicality and rhythm of his sentences. So it is woven together like a song cycle in the sense that it has ebbs and flows and running through with the same characters, some of the same characters and the same themes, and all set in Bulgaria. The teacher or the narrator has a relationship with a man called R, and so that sort of is at the heart of the collection of stories. And they go on some, side trips to Venice and Bologna, I think. Certainly Bologna. Now I'm having a blank whether they went to Venice. But so apart from that, though, it is set in Bulgaria, and just, again, a wonderful sense of place and really interesting observations about that country and the plight of young people there, and the fact a lot of the young people leave or are leaving. And again, these themes of his relationships, there are some very explicit scenes, but they're written so beautifully. And we did this on the podcast, and I spoke about listening to some interviews with Garth Greenwell and listening to him speak about how he writes sentences and how he writes about sex and people wanting, and him wanting to get across on the page, both the person in terms of their body, but also what's going on in their mind, and so that it's the whole person on the page, their consciousness as well as the actions, and that you rarely see that in literature. And he wanted to combine high pornography with high art, I think was the phrase, and he's successfully done that. It is really beautiful to read. And again, what's important, I think, is not just that you care about this character and you're reading between the lines as to some heartbreaking things in his life, and that's not always spelt out, but also each sentence builds suspense and tension. So it is never just describing something for the sake of it, but it's building towards, how will this scene end? Will it, is he safe here? Or will these people get together? Or will this be a relationship that ends well? Or will the holiday end well? Or whatever the case may be, there's always a tension that he sustains, and it's really, again, masterfully done. And for someone who's just at the really near the beginning of his career, it's quite incredible to watch. So that's Cleanness. Amanda and I did it on the podcast, and Amanda said it's one of the best books she's read all year, and I think I would agree as well. So I've just been thinking about that recently. What are my favourite books of the year so far? And I won't go down that path now. It's always so hard to narrow down, but this was a really, really excellent read. So that's Cleanness. And then a couple that I don't have with me because I've donated them to the library, so we might just let those go. And then How Much of These Hills is Gold by C. Pam Zhang. This one has been raved about by Simon Savage, and I think Mercedes on Mercy's Bookish Musings, and I talked about it in my What's Coming Up video for June, July, and Amanda and I just did that on the podcast, so that episode will be up shortly. I really liked this. I didn't know what to expect going in, other than it's a reimagining of the Western genre, and I will come back to that. Hi, I'm back. I had an interruption. I had to go and pick up the kids from school and just didn't leave myself enough time to get through all of these books. So I'm back with the remainder of the June wrap-up, and I don't know what day it is. I think days have passed in the meantime, and I've moved rooms and everything, but it's all good. We're still here. I think I was up to How Much of These Hills is Gold by Pam Zhang, and Amanda and I did this on the podcast, and I really loved it, and Amanda not as much, but we both appreciated it and found it really interesting. So this is a debut novel. It's been getting a lot of buzz. It's a Western, or a modern take on a Western, but featuring an immigrant Chinese family who've moved to, who live in California in the gold rush era. We're following the story of two siblings, Lucy and Sam. When the novel starts, their father has died and they're trying to find a place to bury his body. Then we go on this journey with them, and at one point their paths diverge. Pam Zhang has spoken about what she wanted to do with the Western, and I don't read Westerns, so I can't sort of comment on that as a genre, but she was wanting the action, the element of danger and so on, but then she wanted to slow it down and actually look at the characters and be more reflective. And I think she has done that beautifully, because there is a tension throughout the novel and you do want to see what's happening. There's enough action to propel you forward, but it is a beautifully reflective book, and the language is really poetic. The characters are very singular. I loved both Lucy and Sam. They're very different. It's just a really fun, surprising read. So the things that I loved about this were, it wasn't like anything else I've read. It was refreshing and it surprised me. So it didn't, when I thought I knew what would happen next, that wasn't necessarily what would happen, and I really liked that. So I think she's a very, very assured writer, so it's hard to believe this is a debut. And whilst it wasn't completely, my favourite book of the year, and that's partly just because of that style of the vast open landscape, which I don't, generally like to be in deserts and that sort of thing. But that, having said that, I think she is really accomplished, and I'd be very interested to read whatever she writes next. So that is How Much of These Hills Are Gold. And next up is Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami, translated by, I want to say, David Boyd and Sam Bett. It is, yes, Sam Bett and David Boyd from the Japanese. So we did this on the podcast as well, and that was I think that's just recently, so I have to edit that one. I've got a lot of work to do with that. This one was recommended by Jacqueline at 6 Minutes for Me, and I was hooked by the cover, by the fact that it's a new, fresh voice in Japanese literature, and the blurb by Haruki Murakami, which he says, breathtaking, and then on the back he says, I can never forget the sense of pure astonishment I felt when I first read Breasts and Eggs. And I think I talked about this on my book haul or on my What's Coming Up video, but and as I said in that video, I don't like the title, but nevertheless, I was so intrigued by this one. Unfortunately, I didn't love it, but having said that, because we did it on the podcast, I read a bit about the author, and she's incredible. She's such an original thinker, and she's a feminist voice in Japan, which I think is perhaps more conservative as a society, or in her view it is still very conservative. And so these stories from a woman's point of view and women who don't conform are still, quite rare. Certainly, perhaps in English translation, it's quite rare. And so she's really interesting. She also was a singer-songwriter. She interviewed Haruki Murakami for 16 hours across 4 different sittings in Tokyo, which I find fascinating because he rarely gives interviews, and they had this really interesting discussion, and she questioned him about his portrayal of women in his books, which I loved that she did that. And so it's definitely worth, you know, reading a bit about her, and I really like her as a, you know, as a figure in literature in Japan. And so I wanted to love this, but and I did really appreciate lots of elements of it. But what happened was, it's the story of Natsuko and her sister. So she lives in Tokyo, but she's from Osaka, and Mieko Kawakami is from Osaka, and her sister Makiko comes to stay with her daughter, I think it's Midoriko. And so the first section is their visit, and Makiko wants to get breast enhancement surgery, and she's quite obsessed with it, and that leads to all sorts of musings and thoughts about body image and why women do that and so on. And Midoriko, who's 12 or 13 years old, is also struggling with those issues, and it looks at all sorts of things and Makiko's job as a bar hostess in Osaka, and just living, it's a very tenuous existence, and so you get a real insight into that. Then the second section, I think, is 10 years later, and Natsuko is a writer. She has friendships, and so all the other characters are mainly women, which I really liked. And so you learn about her friendships and her relationship with her sister, and I think she goes on a journey to Osaka, and I didn't quite get that far. I got 2/3 of the way through, and I think it started as a novella, and so then it was sort of two novellas that she's joined together to make this novel, and that might be part of the issue. But I just felt a bit ambivalent about it. So I really liked the insight into life in Tokyo. I liked the fresh perspective. It's very realist. So she gives you all of her thoughts, all of the things that are happening. You really feel like you're there, or certainly getting a warts and all look at this character's life. And so in that sense, it reminded me a bit of Normal People by Sally Rooney, where you feel like you're a fly on the wall and you're just getting very much almost a stream of consciousness, but a really fresh sort of contemporary voice. And I liked that, but for me, it was a bit uneven. It might have been a bit the translation, but I can't judge that because I can't read the original, but it just felt a bit uneven, and it didn't seem to have any narrative drive. I didn't quite know what the point was, or because she gives you all of these thoughts, and some of them are quite profound and others are very mundane. I couldn't work out what I was meant to latch on to and what was driving the story forward, and I didn't have that propulsion, and I got impatient, basically, is what happened. And I know, well, Jacqueline says the second half is stronger. I think that's probably right. It certainly felt like it was picking up, but it just wasn't enough, and I had lots of other things that I really wanted to read, and I felt as if I'd read enough. And I think unless you're really loving a book, if you're not looking forward to picking it up and reading it, then, you know, there's no point. Amanda really liked it, and she took the view that, yes, it was a bit meandering, but she just settled in and thought, okay, I'm just going to hang out with Natsuko for a while. And that is definitely, I think, the way to approach it. So you're just not looking for a big action story, but just enjoying being in her company. And in that sense, it's quite a relaxing read, and with every so often really interesting, thought-provoking thoughts and insights into her views on women in Japan, on body image. A really mixed bag for me. I would sort of give it a 3 out of 5 stars, and I just didn't quite finish it. But I'd be very interested to know what you think if you've read it. And as I say, I'm so fascinated by Mieko Kawakami. I think I'll read more of her, but this wasn't quite... I didn't love it quite as much as I wanted to. So that's Breasts and Eggs. Then one of the books that was waiting for me while I was sort of puttering along with that one is The Nichol Boys by Colson Whiehead. So this has just come out in paperback. So obviously it's not a new release. I should have read this a while ago, but I put it off because of the harrowing subject matter. So it's set in a reform school in Florida in the 1970s. We followed two boys, Elwood and Tucker, and they're, I think, teenagers. I can't remember their age. But anyhow, two black boys that go to this, they're sent to this reform school, and it's supposed to be a school, and they receive an education, and then when they sort of graduate or finish their sentence, they get, released and they go back home. But of course, it's much darker than that, and it is in fact almost like a labour camp where they're treated really poorly and violently, and in some cases the boys are killed, or they die from injuries and so on. And so it's very shocking. And as I say, I put off reading it because I just thought it would be so sort of upsetting and harrowing and depressing. And I knew that it would be one I would read. And of course, it's been so highly praised and awarded, and it won the Pulitzer this year. But I just couldn't quite bring myself to do it. But we did it on the podcast, so I picked it up. And actually, I have to say, I absolutely loved it, if that's the right word you can use about a book with that subject matter. But also, it was not a grim read. And I know that sounds strange, but Colson Whiehead has managed to weave in humour. He has sort of cut through the subject with a sense of humour, and I think that actually mirrors what we are like as humans, in the sense that some of the things we go through or that we inflict on others or that we witness are absurd, and also sometimes things are so bad that you almost have to laugh, or if you don't laugh you'll cry. And there's always, I think there's a very fine line sometimes between tragedy and comedy. He manages to find that line which gives you a relief, so that you, on the one hand, you're reading about something that is very confronting, and on the other hand, he has that sense of satire and humour that kind of balances it out and gives you the lightness with the darkness, which I really, really value. I really appreciated that. And just for example, the first page, the first sentence is, "Even in death, the boys were trouble." So what a heavy hitting, great first sentence. And he goes on to say about how the archaeology students were digging up the land. So what happened is that the school that this was based on, the Dozier School for Boys in Florida, was closed down in 2011 after a series of articles in the Tampa Bay Times, and the state of Florida wanted to sell the land, and then there was some digging where they found some graves, and so that set things back a bit. And so he brings out this sort of satire that is ripe for, because you then have the archaeology students digging up graves and the company finding it really inconvenient. And so on the one hand, it's so shocking. On the other hand, you can just picture this sort of company, property manager finding it a real hassle that they then have to deal with the graves, and, that there's been this inconvenience that's put an obstacle in their path. And so all of that really, I thought, was so clever the way he did it. And it's very tightly written. It moves along quickly, but also at times the writing has a poetry that just stops you in its tracks without being fancy or frilly or anything. There's nothing, not a word is wasted. There's no flowery language, but just the choice of a word here or there that really elevates this into sort of genius territory, I think. So this I highly recommend if you haven't read it. If, like me, you were put off by the fact that it sounded depressing, don't be put off, because it really is very, very engaging, readable. Of course, there's heartbreaking moments, but I really heartily recommend this one. And again, it could be in the list for the books of the year so far. So that's The Nichol Boys by Colson Whitehead. And then an author that I've been really meaning to get to, The Paying Guests by Sarah Waters. So this was our choice. I think this was one of our Pride Month choices, and we'll be doing this on the podcast as well. But Annie's colleague is a huge Sarah Waters fan, so she suggested that we do this one. So quite chunky. So we did, and I think we haven't recorded the discussion yet, so I don't know what Annie thought, but I didn't love it. I think it obviously suffers, coming with huge expectations, because I have been meaning to read Sarah Waters. I've loved the idea of her novels and what I've heard of them. She's been shortlisted for the Booker Prize 3 times and is obviously hugely accomplished. So I certainly expected it to be really good. And, it is, I think, what I expected, but I think just after some of the other books I've been reading, so the CPAM Zhang, which is quite innovative, and the Nichol boys, obviously, and perhaps a few others, this just felt a bit staid. And I think so what it is Frances and her mother are living in London in the 1920s, I want to say, and they take in lodgers or paying guests because they need the money. The father and I think the two brothers have all died in the war or in and around the time of the First World War. So they take in these lodgers, Mr. and Mrs. What are their names? Mr. and Mrs. I've forgotten their name. It's not Bumble, it's Beacon or Benson, something like that. And so Lillian and her husband Len. So then that generates this sort of stirs up desires in Frances that are illicit, and she navigates that and so on. Frances and her mother don't work, which is common for the time, and so they spend their days, she does a lot of housework, they play bridge, they go to a movie on Wednesdays, they visit neighbours, and so it's incredibly dreary. And I think that's the point, is partly just to show what her life, how narrow her life is, and yet being an intelligent woman, she has all these sort of dreams of what might have been, and especially coming through the war where women did start working and were valued more, and then it's become restrictive again. And so there's all of that, is quite interesting. But I really liked A Single Thread by Tracy Chevalier, which talked about that post-war period from a single woman's point of view, I thought really well. And it was quite a contained story, but I think just beautifully written and very distilled and focused. So this is a bit more, bloated isn't the word, but it's a bit more of a completist story. But I think maybe my reading tastes have changed and I didn't want every single scene detailed. Yeah, this one didn't have that same tightness. So I don't want to give too much away, but there are a lot of scenes with the lodgers, they're within the house. It's very stifling and just very old-fashioned. The manners that they all use, tripping over each other in the hallway and being very careful, it's very English, and that did really ring true. So all of her observations I think are spot on, but it just got a bit boring being there with them and for all of these scenes. And then a friendship develops between Frances and Lillian. And so you follow them with this friendship. And Frances, really, I just found her very annoying, actually. And she sort of hangs around. I mean, she doesn't have, as I say, a huge life outside of the home. And so she sort of clings on to Lillian, and it becomes almost quite obsessive and, again, quite repetitious, because these scenes go on for quite some time. Then it takes a turn, which I think it's just all a bit melodramatic. And so it takes a turn that becomes extremely dramatic. And then there's sort of the final section, and it's not even really resolved. And the ending I thought was an anticlimax. So I did read it to the end. It was quite compulsive in the sense that you do keep turning the page, and it's very well written and very well observed, as I said, in terms of the English manners, but I just found it a bit heavy and melodramatic. I think I would have liked it if it was maybe half the length and just distilled into the essential dramatic scenes, perhaps. I don't know, but it wasn't the one for me. So that's The Paying Guests. I don't know how it compares to Sarah Waters' other books, but based on this, I don't think I will read the other ones, but let me know if you think I should. And it's interesting, Annie's friend suggested this out of all of the Sarah Waters books that was the must read. Others have said differently, so I don't know, maybe this was just not the one to start with, but in any case, not for me. But I can also see why it is a compulsive saga type of read that people would enjoy. So it might be that it's just dated a little bit, I don't know. So that's The Paying Guests, that big chunky one that I was very happy to finish. And that brings us to the end of June. So let me know what you've been reading, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.